Thank you, Steve. Now we'll ask for our three panelists to come down and have a seat here in front. We'll take questions from the audience. And I'll start it off because I want to know, Dr. Forbes, you mentioned this. I've rolled the idea around of putting solar panels at my house. You talked about that the return on investment is 3 to 5 years now. For a homeowner, what is the cost of doing that, converting to solar at home?
The upfront cost, I mean, you can look it up. They vary depending on how much you're going to put up and how you're going to use it. But it can be as low as $20,000 to $30,000 all the way up to $150,000, $200,000. Just depends on what you really want to do with it. The return on investment are based on government tax breaks as well as that's from federal and state and county. Although I don't think there's any in the county here, but there are at the state level and there are at the federal level. And so in terms of that net metering fee, well, that's the all important thing in terms of the ROI. If the state of Texas is based on a percentage, they've kind of met the middle ground. So what is reasonable in terms of an ROI is going to depend on the net metering fees, whether or it's a rebate or it's a cost. If it continues its cost, and that's what's causing sort of the weird push of politics, what fascinates me, is you got groups referring to themselves as the Green Tea Party, who are these conservative libertarians who are arguing we should be able to do this without the interference of big utilities or government. And then you've got themselves that are aligning with the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund. And since these weird bedfellows, and those are the groups that are coming together and fighting these reversals of net metering. From the environmental perspective, it's more you're removing any type of incentive that we have to do better or more fuel efficient or energy efficiency and how we produce electricity.
Any other questions? Anybody got a question? Yes, sir.
I have sort of a two-part question. I think Steve might be the best one to address this. I moved here from Houston, and so in Houston, as in most of the rest of Texas, that's part of ERCOT, you have millions of companies to choose from. And so I didn't realize that Lubbock was not part of ERCOT. Right. And I was wondering why that is. There's probably some historical explanation. And then I was also wondering how many of the wind farms in the Panhandle, particularly down near Sweetwater, are actually part of our local interchange and power in Lubbock versus going to other parts of the state.
Well, that's a timely question because ERCOT, the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, is the power pool that is most of the state of Texas. The Panhandle and down to Lubbock is part of what's called the Southwest Power Pool. The Southwest Power Pool, until recently, ended south of Lubbock. It has now pushed its way north of Lubbock because there's pretty substantial wind farm being built on Floyd County. We've been in the Southwest Power Pool for as long as I know, but Lubbock is in the process right now of making a move to ERCOT. In fact, by 2019, when our current contract expires with Xcel Energy, we intend to be part of the ERCOT grid. That's going on right now. Now, bear in mind that doesn't mean that there'll be a change in providers in Lubbock, because within ERCOT, the Texas Public Power Association is the group which is all of the municipal utilities. And we're a municipally owned utility, which means that our city council and the mayor basically are the final word on rates and whatever. We have a board of directors and then a director. The competing companies in ERCOT are investor-owned utilities. They're there to make a buck for investors. Their motive is profit. Our motive is service. There are no municipal utilities in ERCOT that are currently deregulated, although Austin is going through some interesting times right now. There's a possibility that might happen. Our rates have always been really competitive, and I don't think you'll see that happen here, but we're moving in the direction of ERCOT. And to answer your question, right now, the wind farms that you see between here and Dallas or between here and Austin are part of ERCOT, but they're something that we intend to have access to soon. I was telling Robert and some of the folks in CSC earlier, Texas is the largest wind power state in the nation. We have twice as much wind power as the next largest state, which I believe is Iowa. And if I'm not mistaken, if Texas were a country, we would be the 6th largest country in the world.
Yes, sir.
Related to that, when we switch to ERCOT, what will be the percentage of electricity in Lubbock from renewable sources as compared to now?
That is difficult to say specifically, but I would expect that number to rise substantially. There has been a point when 40% of ERCOT's power was provided by wind alone. ERCOT currently has approximately 25,000 megawatts, I think, of wind power, and solar being added to that as well. So whereas at present, I think we're maybe around 10% renewable, I would expect that to increase dramatically. Because Lubbock's going to be in a position where we can go out on the market now and buy renewables. And there have been some folks that have contacted us with some pretty attractive potential future deals that have to do with solar and wind.
Yes, sir.
I have two questions, and they might be more for Robert and Pam. The first question is, in those studies, for example, of Colorado, what kind of agriculture might they have been? And the reason I ask that is we have here on the South Plains a lot of cotton fields with the resident owner or a resident hired hand living in the midst of the cotton field where there is an active well going up and down, and they're very old wells, although we have some new wells in the last 5 years. So those pump jacks that are very, very old, I assume have more leakage than the newer ones, but I don't know that that's the case. Less leakage, maybe because, quote, they're more efficient, using less electricity or less natural gas to move the pump jack up and down. And then later, if somebody else has a question, we'll let them. And the last one would be, when the health board was testifying council to increase the distance of a well from a home, which at that time the council rejected. Did you have the data on benzene? I don't recall hearing the data about benzene at that time.
Well, let me answer your two-part questions. One is, did the Colorado studies control for old versus new wells or agriculture? I know the Colorado studies counted every well, and they would have picked up wells that were used, that were in the midst of agriculture. If they were used for oil and gas, not if they were water wells. I don't know if they controlled for age of wells. One of the other studies, the CSC study, actually did a very complex calculation for production, age of well, and a number of other factors. Certainly, the researchers looked for active wells versus inactive wells. What the researchers in Colorado did was they controlled for other sources of volatile organic compounds. That's why all the studies were done in rural Pennsylvania or rural Colorado, because traffic and highways are a major source of volatile organic compounds, and so that factor was attempted to be controlled for. Regarding what happened in City Council, actually we were successful in our bid to increase setbacks. The Board of Health as members of Board of Health, I was chair of the fracking committee. That's how don't ask me how I started it, but that's how this started. I was chair of the fracking committee, and we came up with recommendations to increase setbacks to 1,500 feet. Our current setbacks are 300. Well, City Council didn't like that very much, and so they set up a oil and gas advisory committee where our voices were diluted by the voices of many stakeholders, And eventually, we recommended to the Oil and Gas Committee rejected our request even to get setbacks to 600 feet and forwarded a recommendation to City Council to stay at 300. But then after that, I and my colleague argued back to City Council based on new data, many of the things I showed you, that it really should be 600 feet. And actually that vote, we won that vote. And so City Council passed an amendment that setback should be increased from 300 to 600. Better than 300, worse than 1,500. And just a few weeks later, after that, House Bill 40 came out, essentially canceling all setbacks that had been voted for by individual cities, placing us back to the Texas standard, which is about 250 feet, more or less.
Yeah, along those lines, I mean, that's how I met
Yeah.
Dr. Epstein when I first arrived here. Catherine got a call saying, is anybody over at Tech doing work on hydraulic fracturing? I've been doing work, that's primarily where my research was, from 2004 forward. So all the recommendations were based on mitigating to the greatest degree possible the risks that are inherent. The idea was, and I told the group, banning is a fool's errand. And HB 40 is a direct reaction to Denton's ban to vote to ban fracking. This charges right up against the state's interest, but in typical fashion, it's a bit hypocritical of them to say the best decisions are made locally because they understand the conditions, and yet, because their interests are at stake in many ways, they basically ceased the local policymaking process with regard to anything to do with hydraulic fracturing. To your question about the rural areas, there's studies out of Duke in the Bakken Shale that demonstrate that it's not just human health that's affected, but agricultural health as well, in terms of like cattle, various other livestock, animals, the ecosystem at writ large, that there is an effect in similar fashion as there are to human proximity. The idea in rural, though, for the most part across the United States, the most intense development is in rural areas as opposed to metropolitan areas, unlike them.
I think we have time for about one more question. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Have folks been able to put a dollar figure in terms of the increased medical cost or is that's the next step to go on
I
beyond?
would love to see that.
Yeah.
It would be very, very good point to make to
Right. So
legislators.
yeah, that would take it into the other green.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Field.
That would be a wonderful field. There was just a paper published on the cost of human illness due to air pollution. Came out this week, and I would love to see a similar study. But you realize these studies just came out since 2014 was the first one. The rest of them are less than a year old now. So yeah, I would love that.
Just real briefly, it's called a closed loop system. So closed loop systems basically capture the produced water as well as the VOCs, as well as natural gas. And it was trial run here in Texas. And the energy producers are actually on board with it because they showed significant savings to their operating costs if they were to do the closed loop systems rather than the old way of doing things. So EPA now, in terms of new wells, are required. They're required those closed loop systems, but in terms of the grandfathered wells, they're not required. So this is Steve's right. You have to argue the other green. You can't argue the green.
So on the Oil and Gas Committee, our requests for a closed loop system were completely met with deaf ears. Whoever heard of this, why would anybody want to do it? It's too expensive.
Sir, do you have a real quick question?
Well, my question was, are there confounding factors in like where these studies were with the oil wells, such as poverty and other things that could be used as to explain?
There were attempts to control for all these factors. For example, benzene levels are very high in smokers. And birth defects are higher in low-income groups. And so there was attempts to randomize and control for all these factors. The researchers did a very good job of attempting to control for these factors. And it's not easy, but yes, they were.
So what's the rebuttal to this? It's pretty straightforward. Is there-
What, the gas wells make you sick?
Yeah.
No, gas wells make you sick.
No, but there's no, I mean, what?
No, the closer you live, the sicker you get. You mean, why was it defeated in Lubbock?
Well,
landowners.
Yeah.
The argument,
It's the other green, I know.
right, the argument that the mayor made was that all this applies to high-volume hydraulic fracturing for natural gas shale wells. And what we have is oil wells and they're low-volume hydraulic fracturing, therefore it doesn't apply. That was the argument.
I believe he also said that we should not have that because this would inhibit residential development in northeast Lubbock. And so we want to have more housing out there. If we had increased setback, investors would not build houses in northeast Lubbock. And of course, he has some real estate out there too. So I don't know, but that is theoretically both an argument. But I don't know if anybody has done a study of proximity of new residential development in terms of people seeking zoning modifications to put in development versus those who are put further away from the well, and I guess in the case of Lubbock, or southwest Lubbock.
You're talking about something called reverse setbacks. A setback is something that the oil and gas driller or operator observes from existing housing. There is something else called a reverse setback where developers are forbidden to build within a certain distance from the oil and gas well. Very few communities went with reverse setback, and that fell on totally deaf ears in the oil and gas community in Lubbock. You know, it's called spoon feeding people or something. So that fell on deaf ears. There are studies showing that property values decrease for houses close to gas wells. And I think that may be politically the most expedient method to deal with this issue.
Do we have anybody here that's got one of the infrared cameras that works in the bandwidth where you can detect the VOCs?
Right now, Grant's got on camera riding around Lubbock doing studies. But yeah, we do have a camera that we can fit with the.
I want to thank everybody for coming out today. We've got to let these fine experts go. Let's give them another round of applause.